Once again, it's that time of year when the nights are long, the cider is strong, and the vibes are oh so very wrong. I'm a big fan of the Halloween season, and I've made annual videos to commemorate it for almost the entire time my channel has existed, but I have to admit that this year I had a lot of trouble coming up with a good subject to talk about. At one point, I was thinking of discussing the new Silent Hill 2 remake, which turned out to be unexpectedly good, and might be a sign that the video game pariah that is Konami is finally starting to turn things around. This could be fantastic news for my beloved Castlevania series, and more generally, it's just an inspiring, feel-good story featuring the return of some very talented people to the franchise they once made great. Which, of course, is actually a good reason for me not to talk about it right now. This is Halloween, after all, not Christmas. Who needs a feel-good story at a time when we're supposed to be feeling scared? And covering breaking news has never really been my bag anyway. There's plenty of review channels and analysts out there who can probably tell you far more about it than I could, especially since most of them have actually played the game. So screw it. Let's talk about pumpkins instead. Pumpkin is an English word used to describe a particular kind of winter squash, specifically those varieties which are orange in color and range in shape between a perfect sphere and a kind of toroidal donutty thing, the latter being what most people think of as typical. Like other squashes, pumpkins are grown and enjoyed all over the world, but they originated in North and South America and didn't come to the attention of Europeans until the early 16th century. The word pumpkin originally stems from a Greek root that means melon, which isn't too surprising when you consider that a melon is the closest thing to a pumpkin that most European immigrants would have seen before. Pumpkins are in fact closely related to European melons. They're both part of the gourd family, and there's evidence that other members of this family were cultivated by humans in both the Old World and the New World thousands of years before the two officially made contact with each other in 1492. Pumpkins are technically the same species as summer squash and zucchini, but the big difference comes in the way these plants are harvested. Summer squashes are taken from the vine when they're still immature and soft, so they can be cooked and eaten whole, while winter squashes, like the pumpkin, are taken much later, after their skin has grown into a hard rind. This means that pumpkins can be kept around as a source of food for much longer, all through the winter in some cases. So what does any of this have to do with Halloween? Not much, but I think you can already see why the pumpkin would be considered a symbol of fall more generally, especially in North America. Unlike other vegetables, which would either be dead or eaten by this point, in late October, pumpkins would still be hanging around the farm to catch someone's attention. I also think there's just something inherently fun and appealing about them. They're brightly colored and come in lots of different sizes and funny shapes, kind of like a natural substitute for balloons. And they're tasty too, which shouldn't be underestimated as a source of inspiration for poets and folklorists. Literary types enjoy their food just as much as the rest of us. The first literary reference to a pumpkin that I can find is Charles Perrault's 1697 fairy tale Cinderella, in which the heroine's fairy godmother turns a humble pumpkin into a coach to take her to the prince's ball, with transformed mice to serve as horses and lizards for footmen. It's entirely possible that this association of pumpkins with magic is the source of the later Halloween tradition, but I would guess that a pumpkin is used here just because it's such an ordinary thing that reflects Cinderella's life of poverty. Also, Cinderella isn't exactly a horror story. Unless you're reading the Brothers Grimm version, in which case, holy crap is it a horror story. Pumpkins were in fact associated with poverty by most Europeans for centuries after they first crossed the Atlantic. Pumpkins were cheap, filling, and easy to grow. A lot like potatoes, and like potatoes, they didn't have much romance associated with them. If they were going to show up in fiction, it would have to be a kind of fiction that centered around the lives of ordinary people, which there wasn't much of until the 19th century. The first real Halloween-y legend involving a pumpkin is Washington Irving's 1820 short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which references it several times as food, but more notably describes a spattered pumpkin being left on the ground near the place where Ichabod Crane is scared out of his wits by the Headless Horseman. This suggests that the severed head that Ichabod is menaced with might have just been a carved pumpkin. It's one of several indications in the story that the night's events aren't really supernatural at all, but rather a trick played on Ichabod by his romantic rival Brom Bones to get rid of him. Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1851 story Feathertop marks the first appearance of a living scarecrow with a carved pumpkin for a head, which I think must have inspired the later character Jack Pumpkinhead, who appears in L. Frank Baum's 1904 novel The Marvelous Land of Oz. Speaking of Oz, by the way, there's a great line from Feathertop where the witch Mother Rigby talks about many a fine gentleman having a pumpkin head, which always reminds me of Dorothy asking the Scarecrow how he can talk if he doesn't have a brain, and him replying, "I don't know. But some people without brains do an awful lot of talking, don't they?" It was also during this century that the concept of a jack-o'-lantern came to be associated with carved pumpkins. The term originally referred to mysterious lights that seemed to hang in midair, also known as will-o'-the-wisps or fool's fire. But at some point, probably based on the idea of one of these lights possessing or inhabiting a pumpkin, it came to have the meaning we now associate with it. There's good reason to believe that the original jack-o'-lanterns were actually carved turnips with candles inside, but by the late 1800s in the United States, the pumpkin version had become definitive. And this is where we really hit the big time with Halloween. Modern Halloween celebrations draw from lots of different traditions, both ancient and modern, religious and profane. But it was during the 20th century that it became the secularized, candy and costume-oriented, and, let's be honest, kind of silly holiday that we know and love. I would say that there's about half a dozen symbols that are strongly associated with Halloween today. Ghosts, witches, black cats, bats, spiders or spiderwebs, and pumpkins. Of these, pumpkins are by far the most common and trend-resistant, and they're the only example which people tend to decorate with using both illustrations and real examples of the thing in question. Outside people's houses? Pumpkins. Halloween at Disneyland? Pumpkins. First Halloween movie poster? Pumpkins. It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown? Well, duh. Pumpkins. And given how ubiquitous pumpkins are in Halloween iconography, as well as their long history in many forms of literature, it's surprising how rare they are in video games, even the ones that feature autumnal or horror-themed iconography. The first pumpkin I really remember from the video games of my childhood is the one you turn into in Banjo-Kazooie, which came out in 1998. That might seem like a long time ago, but it's more than 20 years after the release of the Atari 2600. Also, honestly, this isn't the best showcase of pumpkins being cool or spooky. It's one of the lamer transformations in the game, and it's more cute than it is anything else. There are pumpkins in earlier games that I've played, but they tend to be pretty incidental to the overall design. For example, if you beat the Special Zone in Super Mario World, all of Dinosaur Land will switch over to this awesome fall-themed visual style, including turning piranha plants and beanstalks into jack-o'-lanterns. One of the zones in Super Mario Land 2 actually takes place inside a giant pumpkin, but there's nothing in the actual levels that's pumpkin-themed, which is a bit of a disappointment. There's this little pumpkin guy from Kirby's Dream Land, but he only shows up in extra mode after you beat the game. The closest thing to actual relevance would probably be the Trick-or-Treat Kid from Earthbound, an honest-to-goodness regular enemy that you can fight during the zombie outbreak in Threed. In other words, pumpkins didn't tend to show up in horror games back then, so much as in games with a sense of whimsy. The Japanese game designers who ruled the roost during the 1990s weren't generally familiar with Halloween traditions, and didn't tend to visit parts of the United States that have pumpkins all over the place during the fall, so with few exceptions, they wouldn't think to put pumpkins in their games. Western developers like Rare would be more likely to think of it because Halloween is part of their culture too, but not Japanese ones. In the late 1990s, though, pumpkins began to experience something of a gaming renaissance, particularly in horror or Halloween-themed contexts. The PlayStation game Medieval had 2 entire pumpkin-themed levels, with pumpkin traps, pumpkin enemies, a giant demonic pumpkin boss, and even a pumpkin witch, who is one of the funniest characters in a game full of funny characters. Pumpkins are also a major design element in the Pumpkin Hill level from Sonic Adventure 2, which you may recall featured Knuckles tossing out these mad rhymes. This probably seems crazy, a graveyard theory. A ghost tried to approach me and got leery. Well, I'm spooked. I don't know about you. Digimon introduced the mischievous Pumpkinmon, whose head is a jack-o'-lantern with an axe sticking out of it, during its first season in 1999, and he made it into the second Digimon World game the next year. The year after that, Animal Crossing gave us Jack, the self-styled Czar of Halloween, who roams your town with his followers on Halloween night, playing nasty tricks on anyone who fails to come across with the candy. Jack-o'-lanterns show up as a character class in the 2003 strategy RPG Disgaea, and as enemies in both New Super Mario Bros. And the 2 Super Mario Galaxy games. One also showed up in Zelda as the first boss of Oracle of Seasons, and I want to stick with this one for a bit because the relationship between pumpkins and Zelda underlines an interesting point about how gaming has changed over the last decade or so. It all started when Nintendo decided to use pumpkins as the main crop grown by the inhabitants of Ordon Village, Link's hometown in Twilight Princess. These pumpkins are everywhere, and I must say they're very satisfying to throw. At this guy. But then you get sucked into the Twilight, the whole rest of the game happens, and you kind of forget about the pumpkins. Until this part, where you potter around an icy mansion looking for a special key while an enormous Yeti man makes soup for his sick wife. Yetta, the wife, keeps trying to tell you where the key is, but she has a terrible memory, so instead she first sends you after an Ordon pumpkin they have lying around, then a wheel of cheese, and then, finally, the key. It might seem like the first two journeys are wild goose chases, but you do get something out of it. Soup. I'm sure a lot of people found this dungeon annoying, but I think it's hysterical. I love how prosaic these things you find are, and I also appreciate how homey it makes this insane mountain castle feel, as if Yeto and his wife actually walk around in here to put stuff away, paying no mind to the snow wolves and frost demons, or the fact that every door in their house is locked for some reason. In retrospect, though, Twilight Princess was just the start of something much bigger, and rounder, and orange. In Skyward Sword, even though the story is set thousands of years earlier during Hyrule's ancient history, guess what? It's pumpkins all the way down. Not only does Skyward Sword feature the triumphant return of pumpkin soup, but it has a whole pumpkin-themed restaurant on one of the islands closest to Skyloft called the Lumpy Pumpkin, run by a guy named Pum, and where a side quest involves Link helping with the pumpkin harvest to pay for a chandelier he broke by being an idiot. This is one of the first places that can be visited after leaving Skyloft for the first time, which is to say one of the first places you can choose to go to or not. And the fact that most people do end up going there first is a testament to how entertaining the whole thing is. Or to how annoying Kikwees are. Take your pick. With Breath of the Wild in 2017, as well as its sequel, Tears of the Kingdom, in 2023, pumpkins once again take center stage as a vegetable of importance. Here, they're one of the 3 foods said to be commonly eaten by the ancient Sheikah race, along with bananas and carrots, which may be a reference to the 3 sisters relied upon by many Native American tribes: pumpkins, beans, and corn. Of course, pumpkin soup is back, and in these games you can even make pumpkin pie. Not that there's much reason to. From Zelda to Minecraft to Stardew Valley, pumpkins may well be more prominent in video games now than ever before, albeit primarily as a food rather than as a spooky symbol. You still occasionally see a jack-o'-lantern pop up in more lighthearted horror games like Luigi's Mansion, but these days when you see a pumpkin in a video game, it's far more likely to be on the vine than shivering your spine. So what's changed since the 1990s to make this happen? I think there's 2 major developments at work here. First, the gaming landscape is a lot more international now than it used to be. Unlike in the 1970s, when video games were made almost exclusively in the United States, or the 1990s, when Japanese studios dominated the market, today hit video games are made all over the world, and you can never tell exactly where the next major release will come from, even if it's published by a famous American or Japanese company. Minecraft is currently owned by Microsoft, but its creator, Marcus Persson, is Swedish. Metroid Dread was designed by a studio based in Spain. The developers of the recent Silent Hill 2 remake are Polish. Ubisoft is obviously French, but they also have more than a dozen studios scattered across the globe. With the rise of these European, non-English-speaking countries to prominence, it should come as no surprise that jack-o'-lanterns, which are part of a distinctively English and American tradition, have been on the decline even in horror games. Also, the style of horror that uses classic American Halloween symbols, not just pumpkins, but also black cats and spiders and witches and such, isn't as popular as it once was. It's largely been superseded by more grounded and psychological horror stories on the one hand, and by flashier and more outlandish iconography like that associated with Dia de los Muertos on the other. That's why American game studios, which still hold a huge percentage of the overall market, also tend to avoid the whole jack-o'-lantern aesthetic. It's just too cheesy and familiar to scare people anymore. As for why the non-scary basic pumpkin is on the rise, that I think has a lot to do with the general change in how American and Japanese studios design their games these days. Zelda is a perfect example. When you consider how dark and dramatic something like Ocarina of Time was, pumpkins wouldn't fit with that aesthetic, whether spooky or otherwise. Pumpkins remind people of farming, food, and, well, tradition. They're cozy. Even in Twilight Princess, which is a pretty dramatic game overall, when you interact with the pumpkins, it's always in some relatable, undramatic context, like making soup. The rise of pumpkins in Zelda has gone along with a general tendency to de-emphasize plot progression and story elements in favor of immersing the player in a virtual setting. Breath of the Wild isn't really about defeating Ganon, it's about exploring Hyrule, and pumpkins help to give places like Kakariko Village a more homey atmosphere that beckons the player in. As Zelda takes on a more simulation-y or sandboxy character, little details like the plants that grow in a village start to take on a greater importance, because the game encourages the player to spend more time engaging with the setting and noticing these little details. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's observed that a lot of social media posting about the last 2 Zelda games has had a distinct taking pictures of your food at a restaurant quality to it. In a way, we've come full circle since pumpkins first appeared in literature in the 17th century. Back then, the pumpkin was referred to solely because of its association with the simple pleasures of the poor. Over the next century and a half, a few creative authors twisted its meaning into something scarier and more portentous, a humble everyday object that may nevertheless conceal a wicked spirit which wishes you harm. Then, over time, that image itself turned into a stereotype and lost its power to shock, so that today it's faded into the periphery, leaving us with the uncarved, unassuming vegetable once again triumphant. These days, Halloween is about the only time of year you'll see a jack-o'-lantern, and honestly, I'm not sure how I feel about that. I've mentioned in previous videos that Halloween is my favorite holiday, not because it's scary, but because I like the topsy-turvy carnival attitude that goes along with it, the sense of fun, in other words. So I don't believe that spooky pumpkins deserve to lose their place in pop culture just because they aren't scary. On the other hand, it certainly does seem like we got carried away with pumpkin iconography at some point, and a backlash to that was probably inevitable. Just because pumpkins can last for months doesn't mean we should talk about them for months. If something is truly special, a couple of weeks once a year is probably the right amount of time to enjoy it. Just look at Christmas. So happy Halloween, everybody, and I hope you juice this pumpkin for all it's worth, and then go off tomorrow to do something completely different. Appreciate Halloween for what it is, but don't let it take over your life. After all, when you get right down to it, a pumpkin is just a pumpkin on the inside.
Says you.
Eep!